Paul uses that term for brethren to refer to fellow Jews. So I think it might be referring to Jews who believe in Jesus until their number should be fulfilled when we get to Revelation 12. It's talking about the woman going into the wilderness, and the woman who brought forth Jesus. The woman is the Jewish people, and how when she went into the wilderness and the dragon was angry with the woman and made war against her seed, and then it specifies what kind of her seed, which kept the commandments of God and had the testimony of Jesus Christ. So it's talking about Messianic Jews back then. The Jews that believed in Jesus, they were persecuted heavily. So I think it's also the same thing here, talking about specifically about the Jews that believed in Jesus. I think that's what the brethren means. Verse 12, and I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. What's that talking about? Well, Jesus uses that the imagery in Matthew 24, and if you look, there's a lot of places. I don't have them written down here in my Bible, but just look up those phrases. They're used throughout the Old Testament to prophesy against destruction of different nations. All throughout the Old Testament, you can't read us any of the major prophets without running into that. Peter even used it in the New Testament to describe something that wasn't literal in Acts 3. Actually, no, not Acts 3, Acts 2. When they were filled with the Holy Spirit, Peter stood up and he said, verse 14, Acts 2:14. It says, but Peter, standing up with the 11, lifted up his voice and said unto them, you men of Judea, and all you that dwell at Jerusalem, be this known unto you, and hearken to my words. For these are not drunken, as you suppose, seeing it is but the third hour of the day, which would be 9 o'clock. But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. So he's not saying, well, this is something that maybe Joel's alluding to, but has a greater fulfillment. This is something that he says, no, this is that. This is the fulfillment. This is what Joel's talking about. Well, what does Joel say? In verse 17, and it shall come to pass in the last days. So, like I said earlier, the last days is started when Jesus came. It was the last era. We have BC and AD. It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days of my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in the heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood, and fire, and vaporous smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. So he quoted this as that's the fulfillment. And so he didn't stop at the time. He went on to quote the whole thing. He didn't stop when it talks about the outpouring of the Spirit. He talks about wonders in heaven above and in the earth beneath. And he applies all of that to what happened then. And I think what he's talking about is with the blood and the fire and the sun turning dark and the moon turning into blood. I think he's like talking about, like in the Old Testament, it refers to destruction of a people or a group or God's judgment. And I think he's because he goes on to say, ye men of Israel, hear these words in verse 22. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as you yourselves know. Him being delivered by the predeterminate counsel of foreknowledge of God, you have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. So here we see when he talks about the judgment, using those symbols of the blood, fire, and vaporous smoke, and the sun, and the moon, and blood, and that. You see saying whose it's against. You who have crucified and slain. He doesn't say, well, Pilate just did it. He says, you took part in it. whom God hath raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be a holding of it. And he goes on to talk about the resurrection. But he's pronouncing judgment on those who have who killed Jesus and rejected him. And it goes on to say in verse 37, now when they heard this, they were pricked in their hearts, and said unto Peter and to the rest of the apostles, Men and brethren, what shall we do? They weren't like, Peter, the sun didn't turn dark. They knew exactly what he was referring to. Okay, and so we're in Revelation 6:13. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. So what do the stars of heaven mean? In Judges 5:20, Judges 5:20 says, it's talking about, oh boy. I was talking about all the different tribes and them fighting. 18 is talking about Zebulun and Naphtali fighting, and 19 the kings came and fought, and the kings fought of Canaan by the waters of Megiddo, which also is mentioned in Revelation. 20 says, they fought from heaven, the stars in their courses fought against Sisera. So the stars of heaven just means princes or kings. It's not literally like the stars are living creatures that battle it out. It's a reference when Joseph had his dream. What his dream about? The sun and moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. That just was referring to his father as the head, being the sun, his mother as the moon, and the 11 stars bowing down to him. And verse 14 in Revelation 6, it says, And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places, and the kings of the earth, and great men, and rich men, and chief captains, and mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? If you read that passage, at first glance it seems like it's talking about the end of the world, but there's no one that takes that to be the end of the world, because even those that believe Revelation is for the future, they say that's not talking about the end of the world, because we still have, we're only in chapter 6, we have all the trumpets and the vials yet to happen, so it can't be talking about the end of the world there. So everyone agrees it's not talking about the end of the world. So what's it talking about then? When talking about the mountains and the hills to fall on them, it's a quotation from Hosea 10:8, I believe. Let's see. Okay, it's Hosea 10's talking about Israel fighting against Assyria and Samaria, and verse 7 says, As for Samaria, her king is cut off as the foam upon the water. 8. The high places also of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed, and the thorn and the thistle shall come up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, Cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. O Israel, thou hast sinned from the days of Gibeah, where they stood. So, again, he's talking about God judging Israel back then, when they're crying out to the mountains, cover us, in the hills. So that wasn't the end of the world back then, but he's using images that the Jews back then memorized portions and portions of the Bible. So every time he gives a reference to God judging Israel, it's supposed to be like a slap in the face to the Jews that rejected him, because they knew exactly what he was referring to. So that's the end of Revelation 6. See you tomorrow.